Welcome to the debate. Imagine for a moment standing in an entirely empty theater. There is a script resting on the center stage, but there are no actors, no lighting rigs, no orchestral score.
Mm-hmm.
When you read a manga, you are basically standing in that empty theater. You are the director, the casting agent, and the lighting crew.
Right, you're building the sets in your own mind.
Exactly. You dictate the exact cadence of the characters' voices and the agonizing length of their silences. It is a space of absolute, unchallenged creative control.
But then someone flips the switch on the adaptation.
Yeah.
You hit play on the live-action version, and suddenly, someone else takes the wheel. The lights come up, the music swells, and you are no longer in control. A real person is standing in front of you. Their breath shakes in a way you couldn't possibly choreographed in your head.
Right.
They shatter your carefully constructed mental image, yes, but they replace it with something far more potent. A shared, unpredictable reality.
And that exact tension between the mind's eye and the camera's lens is what we are exploring today. We are looking at the substantive, structural, and psychological differences between two specific storytelling mediums, particularly within the context of romance and boys' love, or BL, narratives.
Yeah, the timeless debate.
Right. So on one side, we have written and drawn material, so manga, manhwa, webtoons. And on the other, we have live-action dramas and movies. The central question we must answer is this: does the purest, most compelling storytelling emerge from the imaginative freedom of a static page or from the sensory immersion and human chemistry of a live-action screen?
And I think we both have very strong opinions on this.
Oh, absolutely. I will be arguing for the supremacy of written and drawn material. It acts as the ultimate director's cut of the mind. Unfiltered, expansive, and completely exact.
Then I will be arguing that live action possesses an undeniable visceral power. It leverages the biological reality of shared human emotion, utilizing psychological and, sensory tools that static pages simply do not have access to, ultimately delivering a far more profound and immediate impact.
Let me begin by establishing the psychological mechanics of reading drawn media. Engaging with a webtoon is an act of active co-creation.
Okay.
The written medium relies on the immense power of what cognitive psychologists might call the internal factor. The creator provides the visual and narrative framework, but your brain, the reader's brain, acts as the rendering engine.
So you're filling in the gaps.
Yes, exactly. You fill in the gaps. You assign the perfect tone to a confession of love. You control the pacing. If you want to linger on a specific panel of a character's tearful realization for 5 minutes because it resonates, you can. Or you can swipe past a mundane subplot in seconds. It is a highly tailored experience.
See, I come at it from a totally different way. While co-creation sounds empowering, it is ultimately a deeply isolated experience.
Isolated.
Yes, you are trapped within the limits of your own imagination. Live action, on the other hand, challenges your isolated rendering by providing a concrete, shared reality. When a story is elevated to the screen, it utilizes profound sensory tools that physically alter the viewer's state.
You mean the music?
Consider the original soundtrack, the OST. Yeah. We aren't just talking about background noise here. A meticulously timed, heart-racing piece of music combined with ambient sound and lighting actually dictates your physiological response.
Right, but
A swelling string section can physically increase your heart rate, communicating more emotional subtext in 3 seconds than, paragraphs of descriptive text ever could.
I don't deny the physiological impact of music, but let's look at the visual mechanism itself. What you call isolation, I call the perfection of the idealized aesthetic.
Ah, the perfect jaw lines.
Exactly. In drawn media, especially manga and manhwa, creators utilize a geometric and aesthetic perfection that reality simply cannot match. The characters frequently possess godlike proportions.
Right.
They have impossible bone structures, flawless hair that defies physics, and eyes designed to convey hyper-exaggerated emotion. And this is not a superficial flaw. It is a critical feature.
A feature?
Yes, it creates a flawless fantasy bubble. It allows the consumer to step completely out of the messy, disappointing reality of everyday life and into a world built purely for aesthetic resonance.
Okay, I have to jump in there. Escapism doesn't require sterility.
Sterility.
When you talk about stepping out of reality, you're describing a beautifully painted vacuum. When we adapt these stories to live action, reality brings the narrative down to earth. And frankly, the physical flaws you want to escape the messy realities? Right. The uneven skin texture, the slightly awkward movement, the voice that cracks under pressure, those are precisely what make our romance feel earned.
Earned? Or just constrained by the limitations of human biology?
Constrained? No, it's...
Because when you adapt a beloved, highly stylized webtoon to live action, there is a universal dread in the fandom. Readers instantly wonder, will the actors ruin the perfect image in my head? When you inject the mundane realities of bad blocking or an actor's inability to perfectly match a drawn expression, doesn't the fantasy pop?
It doesn't pop, it matures. We aren't falling in love with a geometric concept or perfectly inked jawlines. I mean, we are engaging with a person, and live action introduces the most critical variable in any romance.
Which is?
The unpredictable spark between actors. You can draw two characters kissing flawlessly, but you cannot draw chemistry. The biological reality is that humans are neurologically wired with mirror neurons that react specifically to other human faces. When an actor displays genuine vulnerability, when their micro-expressions shift in real time, when blood literally rushes to their capillaries in a genuine blush, our brains recognize that authenticity instantly. It bypasses the cognitive processing required for reading and strikes directly at our empathy centers.
Okay, yes, an actor's charm is a double-edged sword, though. Yes, an actor's natural chemistry, or like their vibe, might revitalize a flat character, but that physical reality also introduces physical boundaries that suffocate the narrative.
Suffocate? How so?
The structural freedom of a webtoon is absolute. Because these characters are drawn, creators aren't hindered by the physical limits of real actors or the financial limits of a production studio.
You mean budget constraints?
Exactly. If an artist wants to set a climactic romantic confession at a massive, opulent masquerade ball or during a torrential, apocalyptic rainstorm, it costs them nothing extra to draw it.
Sure, they just draw the rain.
They don't have to worry about prohibitive CGI budgets, securing location permits, or scheduling around an actor's availability. But more critically, drawn works aren't suffocated by broadcast regulations.
Ah, censorship.
Yes, because they don't need to be ad-friendly for primetime television. Manga and webtoons can explore complex psychological trauma and explicit intimacy in a way that is raw and completely unfiltered.
See, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that unfiltered explicitly means better storytelling. That assumes showing everything is the optimal way to convey emotion.
Well, it certainly conveys the creator's true intent.
I argue the exact opposite. Structural limitations are the very things that refine storytelling. Because live-action directors face strict regional censorship and budget constraints, they cannot rely on explicit shock value or endless expensive spectacle. They are forced to utilize the slow burn and rely entirely on cinematic metaphor.
But sanitizing a webtoon for broadcast isn't just utilizing a metaphor. It's like trying to play a grand piano with half the keys removed.
That's a bit dramatic.
No, it's accurate. Sure, you can still play a recognizable melody, but you lose the complex dissonant chords that made the original piece so haunting. The explicit trauma, the unfiltered intimacy, these aren't just there for shock value. They are the psychological baseline of the narrative. When you artificially obscure that depth just to appease a ratings board, you dilute the creator's true vision.
I completely disagree that it's diluted. The rating board says you can't show the explicit intimacy. So what does a great director do? They weaponize anticipation.
Weaponize anticipation.
Yes, they dive into the psychology of the withheld touch. Because the camera cannot show everything, it holds on the moment right before, a 10-second agonizingly slow pan of a hand that is hovering just inches away from another hand.
Oh, the classic hovering hand.
Combined with a subconscious shift in the lighting palette, moving from cold, isolating blues to warm, inviting ambers, this forces the viewer's brain to simulate the contact before it happens.
Which spikes dopamine.
Harder than actually seeing the explicit act. What is hidden generates a far higher stakes tension than an explicit drawing ever could.
The tension of the withheld touch is a fantastic directorial tool, I grant you that.
Thank you.
But it's a momentary spike. It cannot replace the sheer cumulative weight of explicit psychological depth. And that directly influences how these narratives unfold over time. Written material fundamentally excels at the long game.
Are you talking about the pacing?
I'm talking about living inside a character's head. In long-running comics and webtoons, the extensive use of internal monologue gives the reader direct, unmediated access to a character's deepest insecurities.
Right, the floating thought bubbles.
When they stare at that hand hovering over theirs, we don't just see the hesitation. We read 3 paragraphs of their internal panic, tracing it back to their core motivations.
Sometimes it's a bit much.
But over hundreds of chapters, you aren't just watching a plot unfold. You are building a massive reservoir of empathy. The drawn medium can afford to include filler chapters.
Oh, the dreaded filler.
They aren't dreaded. Scenes of everyday domestic life, quiet conversations, mundane routines like going to the grocery store. These aren't wastes of time. They are the architectural foundation that makes these characters feel like real lived-in companions.
But that architectural foundation frequently collapses under its own weight.
Collapses?
Yes. The long game often devolves into meandering plot lines that drag on for years. We see it constantly in the community, massive reader burnout, because a misunderstanding that could be solved in a single conversation is stretched over 50 chapters of internal monologue.
Well, that's just poor writing, not a medium flaw.
But the medium encourages it. Live action, by contrast, operates like a pressure cooker. It delivers a focused punch.
But forcing everything into a pressure cooker strips away the breathing room.
It forces narrative discipline, because a director is confined to, say, a 12-episode drama format. Trimming the fat becomes an absolute necessity. Every single scene, every single glance must drive the plot forward or reveal something critical about the characters.
So you lose the quiet moments?
You condense the emotional impact. You don't have to wait 4 years of weekly comic updates to reach an emotional payoff. The 12-episode structure ensures the emotional arc is tight, cohesive, and strikes with maximum force. It values the consumer's time while maximizing their emotional return.
I see why you think that efficiency is a virtue. I really do. But that relentless trimming of the fat inevitably excises the crucial cultural nuance that grounds these stories in their specific realities.
Cultural nuance.
Written material, particularly manga and manhwa, is exceptionally good at preserving highly codified cultural rules.
Oh, you're talking about the honorifics and social hierarchies.
Exactly. Take the rigid senpai-kohai dynamic in Japanese narratives, or the sunbae-hobai, senior-junior relationships in Korean stories.
Right.
These aren't just titles. They are complex power imbalances that dictate grammar, behavior, and the boundaries of intimacy, which is the very engine of romantic tension in this genre. The written medium allows the text to explicitly decode this social math for the reader.
Through an internal monologue.
Yes, through that monologue, we can understand exactly why a character is paralyzed by shyness, or why they feel a crushing obligation to act with extreme formality. The thought bubble explains the invisible walls trapping the characters.
That is a compelling point about the invisible walls, I'll give you that. But have you considered that live action communicates those exact same walls without ever needing to pause the narrative for a sociology lecture?
It doesn't pause the narrative, it provides context.
But it's clunky. Humans naturally communicate status and hierarchy through body language. In a Thai or Korean drama, you don't need a floating text box explaining the power dynamic.
But for an international audience,
You just watch a character physically alter their posture when their senior enters the room. You see them bow at a specific deferential angle.
okay, yes.
You watch them avert their gaze or meticulously use 2 hands to pour a drink. These physical actions trigger our immediate, real-world understanding of status and respect. It's the oldest rule in storytelling, right? Show, don't tell. Live action demonstrates these cultural dynamics instantly. whereas written media constantly has to stop and explain the mechanics of its own world.
Point about experiencing it instantly leads us to a fascinating paradox in how fans actually consume these two mediums.
Oh.
It's what we might call the first consumption rule.
Ah, the inevitable trap. Which version do you experience first?
Right. Because whichever medium you start with permanently alters your psychological baseline for the story. If you start with the source material, the drawn media, you receive the pure, uncut vision of the creator. You aren't biased by a director's specific interpretation or an actor's particular cadence. You build the ultimate version of the world.
Yes, but the fatal flaw of starting with the source material is that it almost always turns the consumer into a purist.
A purist.
Yeah, you build such a rigid, inflexible version of the characters in your head that you spend the entire live-action viewing experience keeping score.
Well, if the adaptation is unfaithful...
You resent the adaptive changes. You become obsessed with what was cut or how the lead actor's jawline doesn't exactly match the manhwa panel, rather than actually enjoying the new emotional dimensions the adaptation brings. It breeds a kind of hostility toward a different artistic interpretation.
Because the original was complete.
But starting with the adaptation offers a completely different and often superior psychological baseline. When you go in blind to a live-action drama, you get to experience the plot twists with the full, overwhelming force of high production value. You get the sweeping score, the brilliant, surprising acting choices. It is a total surprise attack on the senses.
But if you start with the adaptation, the original written material is relegated to being just bonus content.
Bonus content?
A static blueprint. And quite often, going backward, returning to silent, still images after you've been conditioned by the high-energy sensory overload of a live-action drama, makes the original work feel slow or hollow.
It is definitely a different pace.
You lose the ability to fully appreciate the deliberate pacing, the quiet intimacy of the page, or those foundational domestic chapters, simply because your brain has been rewired to search for the dopamine hit of the soundtrack and the fast-paced 12-episode climax. You completely rob yourself of the subtlety.
I don't disagree that it requires a mental shift to go backward from screen to page, but having a concrete face and a real human voice assigned to a character can actually make reading the source material easier and far more emotionally resonant later.
Easier?
Yeah, you don't have to do the exhausting work of rendering everything from scratch. You carry the actor's brilliant performance back into the pages with you. You hear their specific voice when you read the dialogue bubbles. The live action actually enhances the drawn media.
I suppose that depends on whether you view the rendering process as exhausting work or as the ultimate creative privilege. Which brings us to a place of synthesis, I think.
Definitely. We've examined the mechanics of imagination, the biology of emotion, physical boundaries, and how cultural nuance is translated.
What becomes incredibly clear through this examination is that the complexity of romance, power dynamics, and human connection actually requires both mediums to be fully understood.
Oh, absolutely.
Having two completely different ways to fall in love with the exact same story is not a redundancy or a flaw in the genre, it is its most unique and defining strength. One medium allows us to meticulously build the story ourselves, brick by psychological brick, living purely in the minds of the characters.
Right.
The other allows us to surrender that control entirely and feel the reality of the story wash over us in an instant.
Exactly. We aren't choosing between a right way and a wrong way to tell a story. We are choosing between the power of perfect artistic intention and the power of messy, undeniable human reality.
And so we leave you with the very question we started with. When you look at that empty theater of a new story, what is your rule for consumption? Do you prefer to sit in the dark, open the script, and build the perfect world in your own mind?
Or do you wait for the lights to come up, the music to play, and allow a real human being to take your breath away? We invite you to consider your own preference.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. See you in the next one.